Guys enjoyed the first day of this new year. Um, just a reminder: Youth Night at Bernie on January 5th, and then our our Sunday gathering on January the 19th for the youth here at the building. Some updates that weren't on the bulletin from this weekend. Um, Carl's test come back. He didn't with no lymphoma, but he's got some more tests pending. Need to remember Linda Alexander. She was having some trouble getting around and some falls. It was mentioned Sunday that Mamie Davis fell down in Florida and possibly fractured her wrist. Has anybody heard anything on Mamie? Okay. And then continue to remember Terry Hendricks. She just got some tests and a lot of things going on. So, are there anything else that needs updated or mentioned before we get started this evening? All right, Colson.
Bow with me. Thank you, God, for the day that you blessed us with. We're thankful for the opportunity to meet here this evening and sing praises to you and take a look at your word and try to apply some things from there to our lives. God, we're thankful for this new year. We're thankful for the opportunities that it will bring, but we're thankful for the blessings of last year. I just am thankful for all of those that you've blessed us abundantly through the last year. I pray that you be with us throughout this new year, and I pray that we can strive to be more like you. God, I pray that you be with those who were mentioned this evening and all those who are sick and hurting at this time. I pray that you be with those who have lost loved ones. I pray that you be with them and their family. I pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen.
Good evening, everybody. If you're using a book, I'll try to make it easy. Before the lesson, we'll sing number 500, 500. We will sing all three verses of that song. Then after William's devotional, we will sing 502 on the same page. We'll sing the first, third, and fourth verse of that. So before, we will sing 500, 500. Oh, it's up there. Okay. 500. O thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy, never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me ever to adore thee, may I still thy goodness prove, while the hope of endless glory fills my heart with joy and love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Never from thee, never leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above.
Good evening and Happy New Year. So I hope today everyone got up and had a big lunch of black-eyed peas, collard greens, and pork today, so you can be healthy, wealthy, and wise in the new year. Or at least this was the tradition for us when we were growing up. We would always have these things on New Year's Day, and to hope for a healthy, wealthy, and wise new year. And I think lots of people have these similar traditions or traditions around food like this. Also here at New Year's, we have a lot of people who make New Year's resolutions. And for many of these goals will revolve around self-betterment and will focus on some aspect of this idea of healthy, wealthy, and wise. I did a little research last night, or I did a little Google search on the internet as to what the most popular New Year's resolutions were going to be for 2025. And here were the top 3 that I saw. One was read more books, which that's, I think, about gaining wisdom. The other was, number 2 was get on a budget, which lends itself to being wealthier. And then the third was actually cutting back on alcohol, which is a goal towards healthier living. And there was actually, it was a list of 60 different resolutions, or the top 60. And, going down the list, every one of those things, the vast majority of them had something to do, or multiple things to do, with this idea of healthy, wealthy, and wise. So I thought tonight it would be a good idea to look at Scripture and see what the Bible has to say about how we can be healthier, wealthier, and wiser here in this new year. So if you would turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 4, starting in verse 7. 1 Timothy chapter 4, starting in verse 7. And here's some thoughts on how to be healthier in this new year. Have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness. While bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance. For to this end we toil and strive, because we have our hope set on the living God, who is the Savior of all people, especially of those who believe. If we want to be healthier in this new year, specifically spiritually healthier, we have to train ourselves in godliness. And while physical exercise is good, and I need to do more physical exercise, Paul says it's of some value, but real health, real value comes from spiritual health and godliness. And I love how Paul characterizes godliness in this passage, as he says it holds the promise for the present life and the life to come also. It's probably just a page over. We want to look at how we can be wealthier in this new year. We're going to be in 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting in verse 17. It reads, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them to not be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they might take hold of that which is truly life." We might not have the largest bank account in the world. We might not have all the earthly money we would like, but we have the opportunity to be rich in good works in everything we do. And in doing that, Paul says we're going to lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven. And what better wealth could we ask for than that? Finally, we're going to look at how we can have more wisdom in this new year. Turn over to Proverbs chapter 2. Proverbs chapter 2, starting in verse 6. "For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice, and watching over the ways of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice, and equity, every good path. For wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will watch over you, and understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil, from men and perverted speech." The Lord is the true source of wisdom. So many people search for wisdom, but it's true wisdom comes from the Lord. And so tonight, if your New Year's resolution was to be more physically active or better manage your finances or try to better understand something about this physical world, I by no means want to discourage you from doing those things. In fact, I think we could look at different scriptures that highlight, how those things are good and beneficial for us. But my goal tonight is what I want to give us some perspective or some things to think about in this new year. And that really, as we're going in this new year, and really for the rest of our lives, we need to be keeping God at the forefront of our plans and focusing on the life to come. One final passage I want to share with you tonight is in Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3, starting in verse 5. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." In this new year, I think if we want to be healthy, wealthy, and wise, there's nothing better that we can do than to trust in the Lord and acknowledge him in all we do. And so this year, if you're needing to make a change in your life, there's no better time to start that right now. And if you need to do that in a public way, you have that opportunity as together we stand and sing.
Oh, they tell me of a home far beyond the skies. Oh, they tell me of a home far away. Oh, they tell me of a home where no storm clouds rise. Oh, they tell me of an unclouded day. Oh, the land of cloudless day. Oh, the land of an unclouded sky. Oh, they tell me of a home where no storm clouds rise. Oh, they tell me of an unclouded day. Oh, they tell me of the King in his beauty there, and they tell me that mine eyes shall behold, where he sits on the throne that is whiter than snow, in the city that is made of gold. Oh, the land of cloudless day. Oh, the land of an unclouded sky. Oh, they tell me of a home where no storm clouds rise. Oh, they tell me of an unclouded day. Oh, they tell me that he smiles on his children there, and his smile drives their sorrows away. And they tell me that no tears ever come again in that lovely land of unclouded day. Oh, the land of cloudless day. Oh, the land of an unclouded sky. Oh, they tell me of a home where no storm clouds rise. Oh, they tell me of an unclouded day. You're dismissed to class.
Bibles to Genesis chapter 17. Genesis chapter 17. Genesis 17 is where we, do I need to stand up here? Or did we take?
It'd be better if anybody's watching online, they can't hear you down here.
Okay, I didn't know if we got that straightened out or not. I will, I'll do the same thing I did Sunday and just try to stay close, I guess. Genesis 17 is, we're just going to kind of recap what we talked about last week. With circumcision, and we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we actually went through everything that's on the slide now. Last week we talked a little bit more about circumcision, how it was just a sign of the covenant, and it wasn't actually what justified people under the law of Moses. And that has some specifics with what Paul says in Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, because sometimes it's easy, like, well, one thing that Paul does, and it's obvious that he does this, is in different places in his writings, he will correlate circumcision and baptism. And the question is, well, what exactly is the correlation? Well, some people have surmised that the correlation has to do with circumcision and baptism, being how circumcision doesn't justify an individual. Therefore, if circumcision and baptism correlate to one another, then baptism doesn't save an individual. And Colossians 2 is one of those places where we see kind of this correlation really take place in, I guess you would say, a more obvious way than other places perhaps. But we noted a few things about this. First of all, that can't be what Paul's trying to talk about, because number one, when Paul describes circumcision and baptism in Colossians chapter 2, what he's doing is he's not highlighting the similarities between circumcision and baptism. He's highlighting the differences between circumcision and baptism. And so what Paul is, he's not wanting us to say, hey, look at these two things and let's compare them. Let's see how they are similar. Similar in our salvation, similar in the Jews' salvation. He's not doing that at all. He's talking about the differences, how they are very distinct practices from one another. And he also, that's the biggest thing that he does, but he also describes how circumcision has been rendered obsolete by the necessity of baptism itself. Because what is baptism? Baptism is a reenactment of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, which is the exact same thing that we do in baptism. And by the way, in Ephesians chapter 2, Ephesians 2 and Colossians 2 go together perfectly. Study those two passages together, and especially with what we're talking about here in the death, burial, and resurrection. And by the way, in Ephesians chapter 2, Paul talks about how we are saved by grace through faith. How are we saved by grace through faith? By dying, being buried, and being raised like Jesus was. That's how we are saved by grace through faith. And so he does something similar in Ephesians 2 by talking about the death, burial, and resurrection side of things. But in Colossians 2, he says that circumcision has been actually rendered obsolete by the very necessity of baptism itself. And then the third one that we noted was something that is kind of a segment. I mentioned that it's not really comical, but at the same time we kind of chuckle when we think about it. If circumcision and baptism are the same thing, if Paul is correlating the similarities between the two, what do we do with women? Women can't be circumcised. And so what do we do with that? And so that's something that we have to take into consideration whenever we're talking about this, if indeed we want to talk about this in the context of being just circumcision or baptism bringing justification. But circumcision was only a sign of the covenant, we learn in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 11. It wasn't actually what justified Abraham. It wasn't what justified anybody under the law of Moses. It was just something that all males were commanded to do on the 8th day. And this would probably have a bigger importance for people who wanted to become proselytes. Because if you're a Gentile and you want to give yourself fully over to Judaism and in regards to the old law, circumcision would be one of those things that you chose to do. In the New Testament, we read about God-fearers. For example, Cornelius was called a God-fearer. All that means was he was doing everything the law required him to do, apparently, but he wasn't circumcised. And so a proselyte is a person who actually went to the degree of being circumcised. And so this would play a key role for Gentiles as far as their obedience to God and their dedication to God. But for a Jew, if you're born into a Jewish family, you're automatically Jewish. And so as you reach the time, probably about 13 years of age was when the bar mitzvah ceremony would have taken place. When you're 13 years old, that's when you become obligated to keep the covenant for yourself. And so Paul talks a little bit about that in Romans chapter 7, but we don't have time to get into that tonight. Questions or comments about any of this before we begin talking about, I think what we talked about last week was we talked about this and we kind of highlighted the rest of the stuff that's on the screen because it was a little bit fresher in our minds. But now we've got the birth of Isaac promised, and this is not new material either. We talked about this a little bit last week as well, but we used the idea of circumcision and the covenant of Abraham to kind of lead into this. But what we have with the birth of Isaac being promised, we have something similar, or several things that are similar between Sarah and Abraham. One of those things is that Sarah has her name changed just like Abraham does. You may remember that Abram means exalted father. He has his name changed to Abraham, which means father of a multitude. And so that seems like there's a drastic difference in the name change with Abraham, going from Abram to Abraham. I mean, that's a big change. Well, Sarah has her name changed as well, but it's less drastic. It doesn't seem to be as meaningful. It goes from Sarai to Sarah. Both of those names mean princess. And so there is not really a change in meaning of her name. There's probably a little bit of a significance because of the reference to king. She's going to be the mother of the princess, and kings are going to come from her womb. And so that's something that can be said there. But the name change is not as drastic. What I think is the most important thing that's being highlighted here is that Sarah is being identified with the covenant just like Abraham is. At this point, Abraham's really the only one that God has said anything to about the covenant. That's going to change and a little bit later on, as we'll see just in a minute. But Sarah's going to be just as much a part of this covenant as Abraham is. And the name change is kind of one of those things that symbolizes that. Also, Sarah is given the promise directly. Sarah is told by the Lord himself that you're going to have a son. And this is where Sarah kind of laughs about it and all of that. And Abraham laughed about it too. But the promise was given directly. Now, the Lord is not talking to Sarah face to face, but he's talking knowing that Sarah is in the general vicinity where she can hear every word. And then you've got Sarah having doubts as well. Sarah has doubts, just like Abraham has doubts. They both laugh, whatever. We looked at this with Romans 4, connected this with Romans 4, verses 18 through 21. Because in Romans 4, verses 18 through 21, one of the things that's talked about is that Abraham never wavered in his faith. And I read that Abraham never wavered in his faith, and then I read passages like him laughing at what God told him, what God promised him, thinking, well, how in the world is that faithful? How does laughing at God that this promise is going to come upon him, how is that faithful? Well, we need to pay attention closely to what the Bible says in Romans chapter 4. It says that he did not waver in unbelief. And so what that means is, yes, Abraham doubted a little bit. Abraham doubted whether or not him and Sarah were going to be able to have this child the way that God said it was going to happen. It doesn't mean that he turned his back on God, but he doubted how and when these things were going to take place, even to the point where he chose to take matters into his own hands. Sarah took matters into her own hands as well, taking Hagar and then eventually giving birth to Ishmael. And Abraham's like, well, hey, I guess Eliezer is going to be the guy that's going to make all these things happen. I'm going to take a servant from my household. That's what happens in chapter 15. But it's not that they were necessarily unfaithful. It's just that, man, this is something crazy that's going to happen in their lives that they could never imagine would ever be able to happen. And so they doubted how and when these things were going to take place, but that doesn't mean that they turned their back on God. And I think that brings a lot of confidence to you and me. That sometimes we are really not sure if things are going to go the way that we would like for them to, or if things are going to happen the way that we need for them to. Is everything going to be all right in my life? I mean, I wonder sometimes about those things. You're going into surgery. I just had 20 inches of my colon removed back in February. I mean, how is he going to do that and I'm still going to survive? I mean, I don't get that. But just because I doubt whether or not God's going to really take care of the situation or how he's going to do it doesn't necessarily mean that I've turned my back on him. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm preaching standing up here. But anyway, any thoughts or comments on any of that? All right, this is what we didn't get to last week, and I do feel like this is something that needs to be said, is that all of this is brought about by the Lord himself. When you look at chapter 18 and you look at verse 1, it says, "And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day." Does anybody have a Bible that does not have Lord in all caps in verse 1 of chapter 18? Some of them won't. Most of them do. But whenever you see the Lord in all caps, anybody know what Hebrew word's being translated there? Yahweh or Yahweh is the way we pronounce it in English because W makes more sense saying "wa" in English, but really it's pronounced Yahweh. Is really the way that it's pronounced. But this is the covenant name of God. This is the Lord himself. And that's a direct contrast to what we read in verse 3. And Abraham said, "O Lord," lowercase letters, "if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant." Anybody ever heard the word Adonai? That is translated, really, it's a version of Adon, which just simply means my Lord. And so this is like the form of address, the form of respect of address. And so you've got the Lord himself coming in human form to Abraham in this instant. And you've got two people that are with him. Now, later on, you're going to see the Lord leave. And then in chapter 19 and verse 1, it says the two angels came to Sodom in the evening. These two other angels, in other words, those who are not the Lord, but still there, they are the ones that went to Sodom and tried to spark Lot and his family to leave Sodom because of its destruction. But you've got the Lord taking care of all this. The Lord himself is the one who has come. You've also got overtones that it's the Lord in this situation. You look at verse 9 of chapter 18. They said to him, "Where is Sarah your wife?" And he said, "She is in the tent." Well, how did he know that Sarah was there? How did he know it's Sarah's name? It's because this is God. God doesn't know Sarah's name. Well, he does because he knows everything. But at no point has Sarah ever had her name revealed to these people. But he knows exactly who it is. This is Sarah. And she's standing close by, which doesn't necessarily mean that she's eavesdropping on the conversation. This is one of those things where in the custom at that time, whenever people were entertaining others that had come into their homes, the wife would oftentimes stay in close proximity to everybody else, everything else that was going on. I think one of the biggest reasons for that is that if anything needs to be done, if these guests need to be served in any way or something, the wife is there in close proximity to be able to take care of that. And so you've got her knowing her name, the Lord knowing her name, but you've also got him knowing that she laughed. Because in verse 12 it says, Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out, myself and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? and say, "Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "No, but you did laugh." Okay, so no, Sarah laughed. Sarah laughed to herself. She didn't laugh out loud. She wasn't trying to be heard. It was just kind of like a, that's going to happen. But he definitely knew that she did this. And so a lot of these things are pointing us to the fact that this is the Lord himself being one of the three that are there. Now, some people will say, well, this is the Godhead, the three of them, all here in divine form. I think that's negated by what we just looked at in chapter 19, verses 1 and 2. Because they automatically, the same people, the Lord stays where he is, Abraham stays with the Lord, and then these two go on to Sodom, and they are called angels. So I don't think that's the case. Anything like that is going on. Now, what's important to notice here, that what we read in verses 13 and 14, that it says in verse 14, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" That's an important phrase, because we're going to find these things, these different things popping up throughout the text, and especially in the Gospel of Luke. When you talk about the birth of, or the foretelling of the birth of John the Baptist and the foretelling of the birth of Jesus, this is something that's going to be in direct parallel to a lot of what's happening here. And so let's look at that together. Somebody go to Luke chapter 1 and read verses 34 through 37. And then let me get another volunteer to read verse 18 of Luke chapter 1. By the way, if anybody's listening on the live stream and you can't hear me, send Jeremy a text message so he'll let me know that that I can try to move a little bit closer. Verse 18. Okay, this is with John the Baptist.
And Zechariah said unto the angel, "Whereby shall I know this? For I'm an old man, and my wife is well stricken in years."
Okay, so there, you got this angel of the Lord appearing to Zechariah while Zechariah is performing his priestly duties. He says, "Hey, you're going to have a son." Well, Elizabeth's barren. She can't have a child. And so what Zechariah does is he says, "How can I know that this is going to happen?" In other words, what Zechariah seems to be asking for is a sign to prove that this is going to take place. Notice how this response from Zechariah is very different from Mary's in verses 34 through 37. Chapter 1, 34 through 37 of Luke. Yeah.
Then Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I do not know a man?" And the angel answered and said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the highest will overshadow you. Therefore also, that the Holy One who is to be born will be called the Son of God. Now indeed, Elizabeth, your relative, has also conceived a son in her old age. And this is now the 6th month of her who was called barren. For with God, nothing will be impossible."
Okay, so with God, nothing will be impossible, or all things are possible. That's very close to what we just read here in verse 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? It's exactly what God says to Mary, or to Sarah, excuse me. But read verse 34 again, if you don't mind.
Then Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I do not know a man?"
Okay, she said, "How can this be, since I do not know a man?" How's that different from Zechariah's question? Zechariah said, "How can I know that these things are going to happen?" Mary said, "How can this be?" Because both of them were skeptical. Both of them wondered, how in the world is this going to happen? But Zechariah is mute for 9 months as a punishment because of his unbelief. But Mary's not. She's just simply told, hey, the Holy Spirit's going to take care of this. And so what Zechariah said, he asked, well, how can I know that this is going to happen? Well, how can you know? Because the angel of the Lord came and told you that this is going to happen. But Mary didn't doubt that it was going to happen. She's like, man, how can this be? I'm barren. And so what we have in Mary's situation, I think, is very close to what Sarah's situation is. I don't think Sarah doubts. I think Romans chapter 4, with what we referenced earlier, would show that Sarah and Abraham, they never turned their back on God. But even though Sarah doubted how these things were going to take place, it wasn't that she just completely rejected the very idea like Zechariah did. And so you've got God saying, or the Lord in this case, and then the angel of the Lord, and Mary's case saying, with God all things are possible. With God nothing is impossible, however the translation renders it. So all of these things are set up by the Lord himself. The visit, the knowing of who exactly Mary was when she didn't make herself known, knowing exactly that she laughed when only she laughed to herself. All of these things are showing that the Lord has his hand in all of this stuff. So, does that make sense? I think that's probably not surprising for any of us to see, to know, because I think a lot of us know this story and we know the biblical text well enough to understand God is behind this, but it's at least helpful for me to look at the passages that explain how God is behind this and how it relates to other places in Scripture where we see similar things. Questions or comments on this before we move on to something else about Abraham? We're kind of moving away from Mary or from Sarah and going on to Abraham again. Okay. Let's talk about Abraham there's another inconsistency in Abraham. This is kind of something that we've seen all throughout his life. He'll be faithful and then he'll be doubtful. Then he'll be faithful, he'll be doubtful. And we're seeing this happen all over again with Abraham here. And this is a little bit more of a lengthy text than what we usually read, but I think it'll be helpful for us to read verses 16 through 21 of chapter 18. We're leading into the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, is what we're leading into. And this kind of explains how what God is kind of letting Abraham know all of these things that are going to take place. And so let's read it together. It says, "Then the men set out from there, and they looked down towards Sodom. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, 'Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him.' Then the Lord said, 'Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know.'" Okay, so God makes known the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to Abraham in this moment. And the question is, why? Why does he do that? And there's no right or wrong answer here, but I'm curious to what your thoughts are. Like, God can just go ahead and just destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for their sinfulness. It seems that the only connection Abraham has to Sodom and Gomorrah is Lot, and so that may have something to do with it. But God really doesn't have to justify himself before Abraham before destroying the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so why does he make this destruction known to Abraham before he ever does it?
He's building his faith, didn't he?
Okay, yeah.
He's telling him he's gonna do this. He knows that Abraham's gonna try to intercede for the people. So he knows he's gonna go through that process with him. And at the end of it, what Abraham's gonna see is God is just,
10,
of
actually.
righteous people, yeah, righteous people. We, we relent. And he said, yeah, fine. I see it as, in all their interactions, I see it like I sometimes did with my children when I was trying to teach them. You let them question things and sort of think through it, experience some things, and then they learn on the other end of it. That's what I think he's doing with them here.
Okay. Anything else?
I think he's showing us patience too, because just like when he destroyed the world with the flood, he did it when there was basically no one left. And if he had waited longer, maybe they wouldn't have been faithful anymore either.
Mm-hmm.
So Lot was there. If he had let Lot stay there, would he have remained faithful? Maybe. But God's showing Abraham too, hey, just like he's saying mercy, I'm letting him go as long as I can. I can't tolerate this anymore. There's basically nothing good left.
Okay. Anything else? There's just some ideas that is God trying to let Abraham know, because Abraham he's going to be the father of all nations, and Abraham has already seen that, hey, not everybody is righteous. After this promise was given, he went to Egypt, and while he made a judgment on Pharaoh, he's not really sure if God's going to protect him when he's in the land of Egypt, and so he lies about Sarah being his wife and all of that. And so he knows that everybody is, there are people from all nations that are sinful, but he's going to be the father of all nations. And so is God just trying to let Abraham, just trying to hint at just how extensive this promise is going to be for Abraham? Perhaps. That's one thing. What about God trying to describe his holy requirement to judge wickedness? That while Abraham, yes, is the holder of this promise, he's going to be the father of all these people, at the end of the day, that doesn't change who God is as a judge of the wicked. And one of the easiest places that you see that in Scripture, at least up until this point, is in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so that may be one thing that God is trying to do. It may be that he wants to show to Abraham that he is perfectly just. And I think one of the reasons why Abraham intercedes for Sodom and Gomorrah is because he is appealing to God's righteousness, to God's justice because of that. And we'll see that here in just a little bit. But perhaps this is what he means when he says, I will go down and I will see their wickedness. That God is going to look at this and he's going to see it for himself, as if he hasn't already seen it. But he's telling Abraham, I'm going to go down and I'm going to see all of this. And so is that kind of a way for God to show Abraham, look, I see this firsthand. They are not doing this against my knowledge. And so all of this judgment is something that I do that still allows me to uphold my justice, uphold my righteousness. Or is it that God responded to the intercession of others? If other people cry out to God for justice, or cry out to God for judgment, or for righteousness, for forgiveness, whatever the case may be, God will hear those people and God will act on behalf of those people. Does that have something to do with it here? If you ask me, as I mentioned, I don't think we can point at one thing. I think everything that has been said here, and I think everything that is on the screen is absolutely right. But it's kind of interesting that when we begin reading about this, God doesn't just go do it, and Abraham responds. God tells Abraham what he's going to do before it ever happens, before Abraham ever has a chance to appeal to the protection of the city, regardless of its wickedness, which is interesting to me. So as we come into the text, though, and the Abraham appealing to God on behalf of the people in Sodom, even though he knows that they are wicked. That's why we've got this, as I mentioned, this inconsistency in Abraham. The reason I say this is an inconsistency is because here we find a display of Abraham's faith. It's right after the fact that God, the Lord himself, has visited Abraham, has told him about the promise again, told Sarah about the promise again. You're going to have this son. All of these things are going to take place. Don't question it. It's going to happen. God has told Abraham all of those things. And so with this promise fresh on Abraham's mind, what Abraham immediately does is he goes and he appeals for the protection of this wicked city, or these wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because he's the father of all nations. And so what is he wanting to do? He's wanting to protect all of these people because he feels like that is something that's part of the promise that's been given him by God. And so he's embracing his promise. He's embracing his role as the father of many nations. And I believe that's why he comes to God and says, look, God, if you find 50 righteous, will you spare the city? God says, yeah. Well, what about 45? God says, yeah. What about 30? What about 20? All the way down to 10, God says, yeah, I won't destroy it. There are 10 people that are righteous. And why does Abraham do that? Because he's embracing his role as the father of many nations. Does that make sense? In the context, I think that's what's going on here. Now, in chapter 20, we're going to find something different. Why I say this inconsistency between Abraham, this inconsistency in Abraham's faith. But let's look and see how what Abraham bases this intercession on. He based it, first of all, yes, sir.
I got a question real quick.
Okay.
Verse 20.
Chapter 18.
Yeah.
Okay.
Says, then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I'll go down and see what they've done. Who's crying out against it?
I think all that means is that this is God's way. Remember, he's talking to Abraham. And he's explaining all of this stuff to him. I don't think anybody necessarily has cried out to God at this point. I think what that's referring to is that God is just aware of how terrible the situation is. The sin has cried out to God. Kind of like the blood of Abraham crying out to him, you know what it says in Genesis chapter 4? I think that's what's going on here. Yeah. Now, it's possible that there have been others, perhaps Lot and others, that have cried out to God.
And it always puzzled me that Lot, who was supposedly righteous, chose to live there.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, all that.
Yeah.
And earlier, when they go out and, Abraham goes down and fights, he's fighting with Sodom and Gomorrah, right?
No.
Against these other kings or whatever. So I just had a thought.
Yeah.
I kind of thought it had to be their sin was so great that it was obvious to God.
Yeah. I'm glad you had that thought, especially the thought about Lot being righteous, because we're going to see something that's very significant about that here in just a second. So, you've got him appealing, and it's because, I think, first of all, because God's righteous, right? And look at what the text says, chapter 18 and verse 23. Notice how often Abraham refers to God's righteousness. It says, then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Verse 25, far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And so you got Abraham talking about the justice of God. It continues on into chapter 19. Chapter 19 and verse 4, it says, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. And so all the people to the last man. There really isn't anybody righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah except for Lot. And so this really does show that God is just. He is being just. Abraham couldn't understand this. Could you understand this? If God came to you and said, I'm destroying this entire nation, and if you can find 10 people that are righteous, I'll preserve it. All right, I'll find 10 people right now. Can't find it. Everybody, except for Lot. Lot's got two son-in-laws, or they're going to be his son-in-laws, that he tries to get them, and they think he's making fun of them. They think he's joking. They won't even go with him. It's only Lot and his two daughters. Remember what happened to his wife, don't you? She looked back and she was turned to a pillar of salt. Lot and his two daughters were the only ones that were saved.
Does it say here, or is it in Hebrews? It says that it's like Lot's soul was vexed every day because he had to live in that sewer, you might say.
Yeah.
Isn't that what it describes him as just or righteous? And that probably Hebrews I had, and it
Yeah.
just says it. He was aware of it and he didn't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Turn
like,
to,
probably should have left, but he didn't.
since you brought it up, turn to 2 Peter 2 and read verse 7. This is going to go into what Jeremy talked about earlier.
Second Peter 2:7.
Mm-hmm.
And delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them, this is what I was thinking of, tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Yeah, and I've got like underlined here the word righteous in 7, twice in 8, to describe Lot.
Yep. Lot was a righteous person. He found himself in this city. Why? Because he loved the nice things. He loved luxury. So, notice what it says in chapter 19 and verse 29. It says, "So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived." You look at verse 30, or it'd be more helpful for us to read verse 9. I think verse 9 is right. Yes, verse 9. It says, they said, "Stand back." These are the men that are about to, these are you got these men, that's these worthless fellows, the Bible calls them. And a lot of times we've got in Jude, it talks about the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, the unnatural desire. A lot of times that's connected with homosexuality, but you can't really say it nicely. What it's really talking about is gang rape, because that's what these men were trying to do. They were trying to rape these two angels that had come to visit God, or came to visit Lot. So that's what we have going on here in this context. And in verse 9, they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn and has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. What is Lot, according to the people that live in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah? He's a sojourner. He hasn't taken up residence in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. He hasn't become a part of the politics. He hasn't become engrossed in all of the things of the city. He's still considered to be a sojourner of the land. Now, they have allowed him to live there as much as he wants to, but why is Lot there to begin with? Because he likes the finer things in life. And so he's not really, you got to give Lot some props for being able to live there and not getting caught up in the wickedness that everybody else was caught up in, but he's there because he likes the nice things. And so whenever they say, "Hey, come on, leave, go," and it says in verse 17, as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And in verse 18, Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great wickedness in saving my life, great kindness, in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved. And the city that he wanted to flee to was the city of Zoar, which turned out to be one of the ally cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Going back to chapter 14 and verse 2 of Genesis, we learn that Zoar was an ally city of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what Lot decided, hey, I can't live here in this city, because it's an ally to Sodom and Gomorrah. I've changed my mind. I don't want to live there. Look at where he goes in verse 30 of chapter 19. Lot went up out of Zoar, lived in the hills with his 2 daughters. The same place he said, man, I can't go there. Well, he ends up going to live in the hills with his 2 daughters. And that's what he chose. And so you've got this love for luxury that Lot has turned completely on its head in this context. He wanted so bad to live in a land of luxury, but he ultimately decided, look, I can't do it. If I want to be righteous, I'm going to have to distance myself from the luxury of this land, because it's not going to be possible, or it's not going to be easy for me to do to maintain this long term. And so you got Lot's ties to luxury, and this is also where the origin of the Moabites and Ammonites come from. You've got Lot and his 2 daughters. Lot doesn't have any male children to allow his lineage to continue. So what his daughters do is they get him drunk. Not what they did is right, but they get him drunk, and they end up having 2 males by him, and those 2 males will eventually be the Moabites and the Ammonites. And those 2 nations, God will explicitly tell the people of Israel in Deuteronomy 2 and verse 9, do not attack these nations. Do not attack these nations. Do not take their land for your possession, because I've given it to Lot and his descendants as a possession. So, thoughts, comments?
Mitchell, you know, when Lot, back to the beginning, when Abraham gave him the option, he didn't go because he didn't know anything, or at least I assume that he knew nothing about anything there until he got there. So as far as liking the better things in life, he didn't know that. He went down to that area because of the lush pasture and the good place for the cattle, the goats, the sheep, and everything else he had.
Yep.
But when you said that he loved the finer things, he may have gotten used to that there, but I don't think he knew anything about that before he ever got down to that area.
Maybe not. But I mean, you could also argue that that's why he chose the lush pasture, because it just, I mean, but you're right about that. I think Abraham.
See, that being for the animals and not for people, you know?
Yeah, I think Abraham shows his true character there as well. He could have said, "Hey, I'm the man of promise. God's promised me that I'm going to be the father of many nations. I'm taking this good land. You go over here and take the scraps." But that's not what Abraham did. Abraham allowed Lot to choose, probably knowing, I mean, what would you choose? Would you choose grass and water and all that stuff, or something that's a little bit more difficult to handle and deal with? But that's exactly what Abraham did. He allowed Lot to make the choice. All right. Thank you for your attention tonight. Next week we'll go to chapter 20 and read chapter 20 in conjunction to chapter 12 for preparation next week.